Imagine living in a country where your future depended entirely on your skin color, your name, or your birthplace. That was America between 1870 and 1913. Could it happen again? Between 1870 and 1913, the laws shaped who had rights, and who was locked out. But survival was about more than what was written on paper. It was about families fighting to hold on. It was about people who refused to give up even when the system was built against them. Today, we are taking a closer look at how white Americans, Black Americans, Native Americans, Asians, and European immigrants survived one of the hardest chapters in American history, and how their struggles still echo in our lives today. For white Americans between 1870 and 1913, life depended heavily on class. The wealthy controlled land, banks, factories, and the government. They lived in large homes, had access to higher education, and built generational wealth with few obstacles in their way. For them, this was a golden age of opportunity, expansion, and power. Poor and working-class white Americans lived a different story. Many worked long hours in dangerous factories, coal mines, or on farms for low wages. They faced hard conditions, high risks, and very little protection. Still, even in struggle, being white gave them certain advantages. They could vote, own property, organize unions, and move more freely than Black Americans, Native people, or immigrants. But poor whites were not free from control. They depended on rich landowners, factory bosses, and bankers to survive. In many company towns, they were paid in company money and trapped in debt, unable to leave. Their children were pushed into labor early, and their chances for education were limited. Rich families controlled the government, the courts, and the economy. And poor whites had little power to change it. When poor whites tried to fight back through strikes or unions, the rich often crushed them with violence, private security forces, and political power. Divide and conquer tactics were also used, encouraging poor whites to blame Black Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants, instead of challenging the wealthy elites who controlled their lives. Being white opened certain doors, but without money, those doors stayed narrow. The system still favored the wealthy, first and always. While white men held political and economic power, white women lived under a very different set of rules. They were still treated as dependents, not full citizens. Even wealthy white women, who lived in comfort, had little control over their own lives. They couldn't vote, and marriage gave their husbands control of their property. They had limited legal rights over their children, their money, and even their bodies. Society expected them to stay at home, raise children, and leave public life to men. Wealth made daily life easier. Rich white women lived in large homes, wore fine clothes, and had access to education, doctors, and travel. They could afford to stay out of factories and dangerous jobs. But comfort did not mean freedom. Poor white women faced even harder realities. They worked long hours in textile mills, on farms, and as domestic servants for the wealthy. They earned low wages, lived in overcrowded housing, and had little protection from abuse or exploitation. Many began working as children and had few chances for education or upward mobility. Still, across class lines, some white women began to organize for change. They started the early suffrage movement, public reform campaigns, and charity work aimed at improving conditions for women and children. Being white gave them social advantages, but being women meant they were still second-class citizens. After the Civil War, Black Americans were recognized as citizens by law, and Black men were given the legal right to vote under the 15th Amendment in 1870. Nearly 50 years before white women gained the same right. But that right came with danger. Trying to vote could cost a Black man his freedom or his life. Across the South, terror groups and white mobs made voting a risk few could afford to take. Black codes, and later Jim Crow laws, were passed to control nearly every part of Black life. Under these laws, Black Americans were required to have proof of employment. If they did not, they could be arrested and forced to work for former slave owners once again. Landowners could accuse Black men of crimes they did not commit, to trap them into unpaid labor. The legal system turned survival into a daily negotiation with danger. For black women, freedom brought little protection. Many worked as maids, cooks, and nannies in white households, where they were often subjected to harassment, violence, and constant threats. They had no legal defense against mistreatment. Black children were vulnerable from the start. Under so-called apprenticeship laws, many were taken from their families and forced to work for white employers, often under brutal conditions. Some faced physical mistreatment. Some faced even worse forms of exploitation that left scars no child should bear. These children grew up knowing that survival meant silence, caution, and strength beyond their years. For Native Americans between 1870 and 1913, survival meant facing the slow, brutal dismantling of their lands, their families, and their way of life. The U.S. government promised peace through treaties, but those promises were broken again and again. Every time Native nations tried to hold onto their land, their culture, or their sovereignty, new policies were created to strip them away. The Dawes Act of 1887 forced Native families to accept small plots of land, breaking apart family unity. If a Native person refused to leave their traditions behind and become a farmer in the white man's way, they risked losing everything. Children were often taken from their families and placed in government-run boarding schools. They were forced to cut their hair, change their names, and abandon everything that connected them to their ancestors. Violence against Native people did not end with the wars of the past. The Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 showed that Native families were still seen as obstacles, not citizens. For Asian Americans between 1870 and 1913, life in America meant working hard in a country that saw them as permanent outsiders. Most early Asian immigrants were Chinese men, brought over to help build the railroads that connected the coasts. They laid railroad tracks across deserts and mountains, doing the most dangerous jobs for the lowest pay. Without their labor, America's westward expansion would have stalled. But as soon as the railroads were complete, many white Americans turned on the workers who helped build them. Racism grew louder. Chinese immigrants were attacked in the streets, pushed out of towns, and blamed for economic problems they did not create. The anger became law with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major immigration law in American history to target a specific race. New Chinese immigrants were banned from entering the country. Those already here could not become citizens, no matter how long they lived or how much they contributed. Japanese immigrants began arriving in larger numbers in the early 1900s. Many coming first to Hawaii or the West Coast. They found opportunities in farming and small businesses, but quickly faced rising hostility too. Newspapers warned of a so-called yellow peril, and laws were passed to limit their ability to own land. Asian Americans were seen as cheap labor when it suited business interests, and as enemies when it did not. They were praised for hard work when needed, then pushed out and punished once their usefulness ended. Between 1870 and 1913, waves of European immigrants came to America chasing a dream of freedom and opportunity. Many arrived from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, carrying little more than hope in the clothes on their backs. The reality they found was harsh. Irish immigrants were called dirty and dangerous. Signs in windows said, "No Irish need apply." They were pushed into the hardest, lowest paying jobs, like digging canals and working in city sanitation. Their neighborhoods were overcrowded, their homes often little more than slums. Italian immigrants faced similar hatred. They were seen as untrustworthy, and were sometimes treated almost as non-white by the dominant society. They labored in agriculture, construction, and factories, frequently facing violence and exploitation. Jewish immigrants, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. They escaped open violence, but were never fully accepted. They were locked out of many schools, neighborhoods, and businesses. Stereotypes and discrimination followed them everywhere. Unlike Black Americans, Native Americans, and Asian immigrants, most European groups eventually found a path to acceptance. Skin color made this possible. The ability to be seen as white enough opened doors that remained closed to others. they gained access to land, education, and opportunity. Doors that opened wider with each passing generation. Some groups even received government support, or informal reparations through housing programs, and policies that helped build wealth. Some native nations received limited reparations through land settlements, but it was only a small fraction of what was taken. Japanese Americans later received formal reparations for the injustice they faced during World War II. Jewish Holocaust survivors received reparations from Germany. Meanwhile, Black Americans, who gave over hundreds of years of free labor, who endured generations of separation, violence, and abuse, have never received any form of reparations. Black Americans worked hard to build wealth, but it was often taken through violence. Like when Black Wall Street, in Oklahoma, was destroyed. Then, the government built highways that went through black neighborhoods and destroyed homes, businesses, and generational wealth. Even when every rule was followed, it didn't matter because the rules were changed to shut them out. Systematic racism was not just an ugly attitude. It was written into the law, housing policies, school systems, and the way businesses and neighborhoods were built. Black Americans struggled to build, but their progress was repeatedly destroyed. And the debt owed to them remains unpaid, both in stolen wealth and in the broken systems that still shape daily life today. Now, more than 100 years after 1913, we face a troubling question. What would it look like if America returned to the way things were between 1870 and 1910? We are already seeing the signs. Civil rights protections are being rolled back. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are being attacked or erased. Support for historically black colleges and universities is under threat. Voter rights are once again being challenged. Fear, division, and open hostility toward progress are rising. At the same time, violence by police against marginalized communities is increasing. White supremacist groups are growing bolder, no longer hiding in the shadows. Across the country, we are seeing the removal and deportation of both undocumented and legal residents. Families who built their lives here for decades are now being torn apart. It raises a chilling question. Is this a trial run? If they can erase the rights of one group today, who will they come for tomorrow? Black Americans have seen this before. Native Americans have lived it before. Asian Americans and immigrants have felt it before. The pattern is familiar. Divide the people. Blame the powerless. Consolidate control. If we are not careful, we could see the entire country slide back into a system where race, background, and birthplace dictates once again who gets to belong and who gets left behind. Some call it Project 2025. That's a wrap. History seekers. Getting to the roots is where history comes alive. We uncover the truth about Africa, African Americans, and American history, one story at a time. For key events from 1870 to 1913, watch Why Trump Praises 1870 to 1913, The Real Story. Thanks for watching. Peace and love.